The call came in at 3:17 in the morning, a panicked whisper barely audible over the static. "Something's wrong. I think he's gone." The voice on the other end belonged to a frantic mother in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where the biggest crime was a stolen garden gnome. But what her son Michael had done, as she'd put it, was far more sinister. He wasn't missing. He was a missing person's greatest fear. A chill ran down the dispatcher's spine as she listened to the woman's broken, trembling words. "He's not here, and I just found a note." The note, left on a small, blood-spattered desk, contained a single, chilling sentence scrawled in a child's handwriting. "You can't catch me." This wasn't a joke. It was the start of a cat-and-mouse game with a killer, a predator whose dark journey began not in the shadows of a back alley, but in the traumatic quiet of a deeply dysfunctional home. A home where a mother's love had been twisted into a tool of torment, where a childhood was a silent prison, and where every act of cruelty was a nail hammered into the coffin of a young boy's soul. What you are about to witness is the brutal culmination of years of abuse, a psychological case study on how a broken child becomes a cold-blooded killer. This is the story of a monster, yes, but more importantly, it's the story of how that monster was made. Our story begins in the sprawling suburbs of a Midwestern city, a place of manicured lawns and white picket fences. On the surface, the Carter family was a picture of American normalcy. The victim, a vivacious 16-year-old high school student named Lily Peterson, was a shining example of teenage promise. She was a star athlete on the swim team, a volunteer at a local animal shelter, and a beloved friend to everyone she met. Her laugh, infectious and genuine, could light up a room. Her friends recall her as someone who was always there to listen, to help, and to offer a kind word. Lily's dreams were simple and ambitious. She wanted to be a marine biologist, to work with dolphins, and to travel the world. In the weeks leading up to the crime, she had been excitedly planning for a school trip to Florida, a trip she would never take. In the same town, living just a few miles away, was Michael Carter, the eventual perpetrator. From the outside, Michael seemed unremarkable. He was a quiet, withdrawn 17-year-old who kept to himself. But behind the closed doors of his home, a different reality festered. Michael's childhood was a relentless cycle of physical and emotional abuse at the hands of his mother, a woman who controlled him with a chilling, cold-hearted brutality. She believed in tough love to an extreme degree, using a belt, a wooden spoon, and her own fists as tools of discipline. Michael was not allowed to play with other children, to have friends, or to express any emotion other than compliance. His every move was monitored, and every mistake was met with a swift and vicious punishment. He was a ghost in his own home, and his childhood was a silent scream that no one heard. This abuse was a powerful, dark crucible that shaped Michael's developing mind. He learned to detach himself from his emotions, to view others as objects, and to associate pain with control. The trauma he endured as a child festered, turning into a deep-seated rage and a desperate need for power. He saw himself as a victim, a puppet whose strings were being pulled by a cruel and uncaring world. He began to fantasize about gaining control, about being the one to pull the strings, to inflict the pain he had so often received. These fantasies, at first a quiet escape from his reality, grew into a twisted, dark obsession. In the days leading up to the crime, Michael's mother had confiscated his new video game console, a small act of cruelty that would have devastating consequences. The act, seemingly insignificant, was the final straw for a young man who had been pushed to his breaking point. The years of abuse, the lack of human connection, and the deep-seated anger inside him finally boiled over. He was no longer just a victim of his circumstances. He was a ticking time bomb, and a beautiful, innocent girl named Lily Peterson was about to become the target of his twisted need for control. The small, quiet town was about to witness a crime so horrific it would forever shatter its illusion of suburban peace. The night of Lily Peterson's disappearance was a cold, misty Friday in October. Her parents had given her permission to attend a late-night high school football game, and after a brief conversation with them on the phone, she had assured them she was on her way home, but she never made it. At 11:45 p.m., a surveillance camera from a nearby convenience store captured the last known footage of Lily. She was walking alone, humming to herself, a cheerful bounce in her step. It was a mundane image, one that, in hindsight, would be looked at again and again by investigators, each time with a deeper sense of dread. According to later testimony, Michael Carter had been lurking in the shadows of a nearby park, waiting. He had no plan, no specific target, just a desperate, seething rage that needed an outlet. When he saw Lily walking by, her bright spirit a stark contrast to his inner turmoil, something inside him snapped. He emerged from the darkness, a shadowy figure in a hoodie, and quickly approached her. Lily, in her trusting naivety, didn't sense any danger, but she was wrong. The events that followed unfolded in a horrifying sequence. Michael, in a moment of brute force, grabbed Lily from behind and covered her mouth, dragging her into the park. The attack was swift and brutal. Lily, a trained athlete, fought back with a ferocity that surprised Michael, but her strength was no match for his desperate, unhinged rage. She managed to scream once, a brief, muffled cry that was quickly silenced. A dog walker, passing by at the moment, later recalled hearing a strange yelp, but dismissed it as an animal in distress. This was the only warning sign, the only chance to save her, and it was lost. Michael, fueled by a desire for control he had never known, continued his brutal assault. The details of the crime were so heinous that they were later redacted from public court documents. The act was not one of passion, but of chilling, deliberate violence, a way for Michael to inflict the pain he had been carrying for years. It was an act of cold-blooded revenge against a world he felt had betrayed him. After the crime, Michael didn't panic. He took his time, meticulously cleaning the scene and moving Lily's body to a secluded area of the park, a place he knew well from his lonely childhood. The act was a testament to his methodical nature, a chilling display of a mind that had been warped by years of abuse. The aftermath was a scene of eerie calm. Michael walked home, his hands shaking, his mind in a state of dissociative calm. He showered, changed his clothes, and went to bed, a perfect picture of normalcy. The next morning, Lily's family reported her missing, and the police were alerted. They launched a search, and it was a dog walker, the same one who had heard the strange yelp the night before, who found her body hidden in a thicket of bushes. The discovery sent shockwaves through the quiet town, and the hunt for a killer had begun. The police, with no leads and no suspects, were in a race against time to find a predator who, in his twisted mind, had finally found the power he had always craved. The investigation into Lily Peterson's murder was a baffling and frustrating affair. The crime scene, while gruesome, offered little in the way of immediate clues. There were no fingerprints, no discarded weapons, and no clear signs of a struggle. The police, with little to go on, were forced to rely on the most basic of investigative tools: interviews, surveillance footage, and a team of forensic specialists. The police first interviewed Lily's friends and family, hoping to find a clue to her last movements or a potential suspect. But everyone they spoke to described Lily as a kind, loving girl with no enemies. Her family was devastated, and her friends were in a state of shock. The police had a victim, but no clear motive or suspect. They were in a race against time, with a killer who, they believed, was a methodical and calculated individual, a predator who was likely to strike again. The case was a media sensation. The image of a beautiful, innocent girl, murdered in a quiet suburban town, captivated the nation. The media, in its relentless pursuit of a story, put immense pressure on the police to find the killer. But the police were struggling. They had a mountain of evidence, but no clear path forward. They brought in a team of criminal profilers from the FBI, who, after a careful review of the evidence, created a profile of the killer. The profilers believed the killer was a young, white male in his late teens or early 20s, with a history of emotional or physical abuse. They also believed the killer was a loner, an outcast who had a deep-seated rage and a desperate need for control. The profile was a terrifyingly accurate description of Michael Carter, but at the time, he was not on their radar. The breakthrough in the case came from a seemingly insignificant piece of evidence: a single, black hair found on Lily's clothing. The hair was so small that it could have been easily missed, but a meticulous forensic specialist had found it and sent it to a lab for DNA testing. The DNA was a partial match, but it was enough to give the police a lead. They ran the DNA through a national database, but they came up with nothing. The case was at a standstill, and the police were getting desperate. Then, a detective, in a moment of intuition, had a chilling realization. The DNA was a partial match, which meant the killer was a relative of someone in the database. The detective, using a new form of genetic genealogy, began to build a family tree, and in a few short weeks, he had a list of a few hundred possible suspects. The list was still long, but it was a start. The detective, with the help of the FBI, began to cross-reference the list with the local high school attendance records. And that's when they found a name that stood out: Michael Carter. He had a history of being a loner, an outcast, and a boy who had been a victim of abuse. The police had found their man, but they still had no idea what had happened in his life that had led him to commit such a heinous crime. The arrest of Michael Carter was a tense and emotional affair. On a cold morning in December, two detectives knocked on the door of his home, and they were met by his mother, a woman who, in her cold, emotionless demeanor, seemed to have no idea what was happening. When Michael was brought into the room, he was calm and collected. He listened to the detectives, read him his rights, and he calmly answered their questions. He was a perfect picture of normalcy, a chilling display of a mind that had been warped by years of abuse. In the interrogation room, Michael was a different person. He was quiet, withdrawn, and unresponsive. The detectives, in a desperate attempt to get him to talk, began to talk about his childhood, about his mother, and about the abuse he had suffered. And that's when he broke. The floodgates opened, and he began to talk about his life, about the years of abuse, and about the rage that had been festering inside him. He didn't confess to the murder, not at first, but his story was filled with a chilling, detached calm that made the detectives' blood run cold. They had found their killer, but they still had no idea what had truly happened on that fateful night. The trial of Michael Carter was a media circus. The public, in its morbid fascination, was glued to the television screens, watching a legal drama that was as much a psychological case study as it was a murder trial. The prosecution, led by a fierce and determined prosecutor, presented a mountain of evidence against Michael, from the DNA in Lily's clothing to the eyewitness testimony from the dog walker. They argued that Michael was a cold-blooded, premeditated murderer who had planned the crime for months. They painted a picture of a monster, a predator who had stalked and killed an innocent girl. The defense, led by a compassionate and determined public defender, had a much more difficult task. They had to defend a man who, by his own admission, had a history of violence and abuse. They argued that Michael was a victim of his circumstances, a boy who had been pushed to the breaking point by years of abuse. They presented testimony from psychologists and social workers who testified about the devastating effects of childhood trauma and how it can twist a mind. They argued that Michael was not a monster, but a deeply disturbed young man who had been pushed to the edge. The trial was filled with emotional testimony, from Lily's heartbroken family to Michael's own family, who, in their cold and emotionless demeanor, seemed to have no idea what was happening. The jury, in its difficult task of deciding a man's fate, was faced with a choice. Was Michael Carter a monster or a victim? In the end, they found him guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict was a moment of justice for Lily's family, but for Michael, it was a moment of finality. He was no longer a victim. He was a murderer. The aftermath of the Michael Carter case was a long and difficult journey for everyone involved. For Lily's family, the verdict brought a sense of finality, but it did not bring back their beloved daughter. They had to live with the knowledge that a monster had taken their daughter's life, and that the person responsible was a young man who had been a victim himself. The family, in a moment of remarkable grace, started a foundation in Lily's name, a foundation that would work to prevent childhood abuse and to help victims of trauma. Their work was a testament to their love for their daughter and their desire to turn a tragedy into a positive force for change. For Michael Carter, the verdict was the end of a long and twisted journey. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, a sentence that was a moment of justice for his victims, but a moment of finality for him. He was no longer a victim. He was a murderer. He was sent to a maximum security prison, and in the years that followed, he would become a case study for psychologists and criminal profilers. His story was a chilling reminder of the devastating effects of childhood trauma and the long-term consequences of abuse. The case of Michael Carter had a profound and lasting impact on American society. It brought to light the devastating effects of childhood abuse and the long-term consequences of trauma. It sparked a national conversation about the need for better child protection laws, and it led to a new wave of research into the psychology of serial killers. The case was a stark reminder that a serial killer is not a monster born from the shadows, but a human being who's been broken and twisted by a lifetime of abuse and neglect. It was a case that forced society to confront a difficult truth, that a monster can be made, not born. The case also had a lasting impact on the legal system. The defense's argument that Michael was a victim of his circumstances was a powerful one, and it sparked a debate about the role of childhood trauma in criminal cases. While the defense's argument was not enough to save Michael from a life sentence, it did open up a new avenue of legal defense, and it led to a new wave of research into the psychology of criminal behavior. The case was a reminder that the legal system is not just about justice. It is also about understanding the human mind and the complex factors that can lead to a person's downfall. The psychological profile of Michael Carter is a chilling case study in the link between childhood trauma and violent behavior. Michael's actions were not random. They were a direct result of his upbringing, the abuse he suffered at the hands of his mother, particularly the emotional and psychological torment, created a profound sense of powerlessness and rage. His abuse was not a one-time event. It was a constant, relentless cycle that taught him to view the world as a place of cruelty and to see people as objects to be controlled. His antisocial personality disorder, a common diagnosis in serial killers, was a direct result of his trauma. He had no empathy, no remorse, and no sense of a moral compass. His actions were not driven by emotion, but by a cold, calculated desire for power and control. He was a textbook case of a killer made, not born. He was a product of a deeply broken system, a system that had failed to protect him from his mother's abuse. The justice system's handling of the case, while a victory for Lily's family, was also a sobering reminder of the flaws in the system. The legal system, in its focus on punishment, often fails to address the root cause of the crime. Michael's case is a powerful reminder that the legal system is not just about justice. It is also about understanding the human mind. The defense's argument, while not enough to save Michael from a life sentence, was a crucial step in a new legal debate about the role of childhood trauma in criminal cases. It was a reminder that the legal system must evolve to meet the challenges of a complex and ever-changing world. The case of Michael Carter is a haunting and unforgettable chapter in American true crime history. It is a story of a young man who was twisted by a lifetime of abuse and who, in a moment of rage, committed a heinous crime that shattered a quiet suburban town. But what if there was another person in that house? What if the mother, the woman who had caused so much pain, had also been a victim of her own twisted childhood? The truth, as is often the case in these stories, is far more complicated than it appears. The most chilling aspect of the case is a simple but unsettling fact. Michael Carter's mother never cried. Not when the police came to the door, not when she was interviewed, and not even when her son was found guilty of a horrific crime. In every interaction, she was calm, collected, and emotionless, a perfect reflection of the man she had created. The cold, unfeeling stare of a woman who, in her own twisted way, had won. So, we are left with a final chilling question. What would you have done if you had been a neighbor? If you had seen the quiet boy who never smiled, the boy who was always alone, would you have said something? Would you have reached out a hand? Or would you have simply dismissed him as a quiet boy, a weird boy, and walked away? The case of Michael Carter reminds us that the monster in the shadows is often a product of a dark and twisted childhood.